Hi, I'm Dawn Cavanaugh, APQS National Education Director. Let's learn how to do a pantograph with your APQS quilting machine. Before we get started, it's important for you to understand that the relationship between the needle and the laser pointer on the pantograph side of your table represent the exact same thing. Wherever I position my needle on the front of the machine and where I look in the laser on the back, it's like looking at the same spot. So let's take a look at how the needle is positioned at the moment up on the front of the machine next to my pretend quilt that I've drawn on this fabric. At the moment, I've positioned the needle just next to the edge of my imaginary quilt that I've drawn on this fabric. When I walk to the pantograph side of the table, this location and the laser will represent the same thing. Any place I move the needle along this line, the laser will also move in relation to that same location. I've moved to the pantograph side of my quilting table now. I still have the needle aligned with the edge of my quilt, but I've also got the laser pointing down on the pantograph on top of the template plastic. Notice that as I move my quilting machine along the edge of my imaginary quilt, the laser also follows suit. You'll see it following along on the piece of pantograph paper. I don't really know just yet where this line is without giving myself a reference. So I'm actually going to use a dry erase marker, and I'm going to draw right on top of the template plastic as I move the quilting machine along the edge of the quilt. I'm going to align the needle and start sketching where that laser strikes the pantograph plastic as the needle stays right along the edge of my quilt. Take your time. When you reach the corner of your quilt, you'll now start marking all along the bottom that represents the edge of your quilt. This marking will help us to identify where we need to keep our quilting lines and where we will allow them to fall off the actual quilt edges. I'll continue marking this and we'll pick up at the opposite side of the quilt. I have continued to watch my needle next to my quilting fabric, and as I'm moving the quilting machine along the edge of the quilt, I'm also marking the plastic on top of my pantograph. Soon I'll reach the corner and then I'll start drawing up the side. Right there's the corner. Now I'll continue drawing up the side of the quilt, moving the needle and aligning it with the laser. Again, this is going to tell me where I have to stop quilting. That represents the edge of the fabric. There we are. As I move the laser along my dry erase marker, and as you watch the needle on the fabric, they represent the same location. Now you can see that part of my pantograph design falls within the box that represents my quilt, but much of the pantograph design falls outside. This will allow me to allow this design to fall off the edge, and this design will remain on the quilt surface. As I quilt, whenever my laser runs into one of my dry erase lines, I'll simply quilt along the edge, which means I'll just barely be on the quilt itself, jump up, continue, follow along, doing the same thing on each of those edges. Well, before I start quilting, I thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about the kind of pantograph that you choose. When you're new to pantograph quilting, choose a design that doesn't have a lot of real representation. It's easy then to get off the line a little bit and not necessarily worry when you happen to wobble a little bit or change the design. I also want to point out a great pantograph design that works really well in that this designer has given me references. The designer has provided information about where the main line is that I'm stitching, but she's also provided ghost lines so that I know where the previous row of stitching is going to align, as well as where the next line is supposed to be. As you look at this pattern from Digitech Patterns, The dark line is the main or full pantograph that I will quilt. The ghost lines, representing the previous lines of stitching, are at the bottom of the pantograph. Those will help me line it up as I have to advance my quilt. You know, one of the best ways to get good at pantograph quilting is the dreaded practice, practice, practice. The more you practice, the better you're going to get. Here are just a couple of tips to get you started. Think of the pantograph's line as a suggestion. If you happen to steer off the line a little bit, think about what happens when you might happen to let your car wander a little bit off the edge of the roadway. If you jerk the wheel and grab yourself, get back on that road suddenly, everything will feel like you're out of control, and that will actually show up in your quilting. But if it happens to the same thing where your car slips off the edge and you gently bring the car back in line, you're not going to notice that you actually had that little wobble on the road, and that's going to not show up in your pantograph. Since the line is just a suggestion and nobody's going to have this piece of paper laying next to your quilt to compare, making sure you stayed on every single line, just take your time. If you wander off, wander back on it again. You can stand anywhere you want on your quilting machine's rear side so that you're comfortable with the motion. I'm going to get us started by moving to the right edge of the pantograph table. The machines work best from right to left when you stand on that pantograph side. And we'll get started. Let me show you how the full pantograph design actually falls off the representation of my quilt with the dry erase. You can see that as my finger follows along, the first time that the quilt's pantograph design comes in contact with the real quilt is in this small corner. Certainly that's going to be covered by binding, so I typically won't need to stitch that. This part will fall off the edge. So this is the first line where my pantograph will actually start on top of my quilt surface. Once I quilt this area and the laser bumps into this dry erase marker, I can simply scoot along until I get to the next line to complete. As you watch this particular pantograph, you'll notice that it actually sings clear up here. So I'll have to think about making a small change here and coming up and also catching that little bitty point at the top. I've paused just a moment to remind you again, as my laser approaches my dry erase marker, which also represents the edge of my quilt, I'll simply stitch along the dry erase line or move the laser so it follows that, and then jump up again into the pattern. I have drawn the entire pattern so that the design spills off the edge of my quilt on all of the edges. The next row that we advance to, we will stitch the complete row. So let's finish this out with our stitching and find out how to align the very next row. Well, I've completed the first partial row across the edge of my quilt, and it's fallen off all of the edges, the top of the quilt, the left and right sides as well. Next up, I've got to roll the quilt ahead. I don't have enough room for another row. Keep in mind that as I keep going now, I'm going to want a full row of my design on the quilt, not the partial one that I just completed. So I'm going to wipe the dry erase line off that represents the top long edge of my quilt, but I'll still need the sides of those references still in place. When I roll the quilt ahead, I need to know where those reference marks are, so we're going to take a look at that next. I have removed the long dry erase marker that represents the bottom or top of my quilt. Now I've got to find a reference point so I can roll ahead. I'm going to align my needle on top of one of the sharp points at the top of my quilted design, right up there. The needle's in line with that. Now if you look at the pantograph down on my table, you'll notice that the laser is also in that same point. This is the line I actually stitched with the quilting machine. In order for me to roll my fabric ahead and get the next row aligned properly, this actual quilting line, this fabric, is going to roll up on my quilting frame. And that traveling line is going to come down here. Now, take a look at the ghost image the designer has given me. Notice that that shape looks exactly like the shape above. So as I roll the fabric, I'm going to make sure that my needle aligns with this point at the same time. I'll roll that ahead so you can get a better idea of how that's going to work. I've rolled the quilt ahead. Just have to make sure I don't roll too far so that the areas where my pantograph nestled into the previous rows fall under my leveler bar. Be sure to stop and leave yourself plenty of room. I've rolled the fabric ahead, as you can see. Now I need to bring my needle back down in line with the point we're using for reference. I'll align the needle on top of that point. If you feel more comfortable so that it will stay in place, feel free to use your needle down button or needle up button to hold the machine in place. I have aligned the needle with our reference point and put it down to keep its place. But when I look down at the pattern and where the laser is now, the laser didn't move on top of my ghost pattern. Keep in mind the laser and the needle are the same representation. So I need to move the laser dot so that it is also in the same point as my needle. All I need to do is loosen the knob on that laser, move it down, and now it's exactly in the same spot as my needle is back on the fabric. I've aligned the ghost image, that's what I really quilted, with the laser. Now all I have to do is quilt the next row. I've moved the quilting machine over to the right side so I can start the second complete row of my pattern. I've also extended the line that represents the edge of my quilt, but I've removed the line that blocked off a portion of my design. So as I study the pantograph, I can see that I'm going to need to come in right here to begin my quilting of the second complete row. Again, whenever my laser reaches the edge, I'll simply scoot along the dry erase marker and then continue all the way over to the opposite edge. So you can see quilting a pantograph is actually very easy. Of course, there's more than one way to tackle it. This is just one way to get you started. Using the dry erase trick helps you to get close to the edge of your quilt or all the way off and back on again. Think about, of course, how you will secure the edges of your quilt to the batting and the backing before you do a pantograph. The most common way to do that is with a partial float method. Take a look at our blogs to learn more about that, we've done in a previous article. When you reach the other end of your quilt, or the bottom, we're going to have to do the same thing we did across the top. I will draw on my Pantograph plastic where the edge of my quilt top actually falls to tell me where I should stop quilting on the other end, so that I just have a portion of the Pantograph on that side. Have fun with your pantographs and your quilting. Be sure to visit us at www.apqs.com for more helpful tips to get you started with your quilting projects. Happy quilting!